what if the history you were taught is only a fraction of what actually happened? Not wrong, not fake, but incomplete, because from the very beginning, we are taught to see history as a straight line. Ancient civilizations rise, empires expand, knowledge grows, and over time, humanity progresses step by step toward the modern world. It feels structured, logical, predictable. Past leads to present. Present leads to future. But here's the question most people never stop to ask. How much of that timeline is actually known and how much of it is assumed? David Icke often challenges this idea by pointing out something simple but easy to overlook. History is not the past itself. It is a reconstruction of the past, a version of events built from surviving records, artifacts, and interpretations. And those records are not complete. They never have been. Entire libraries have been destroyed. Civilizations have collapsed, leaving behind only fragments of their existence. Languages have been lost, making certain texts impossible to fully understand. Over thousands of years, information disappears not intentionally, but inevitably. So what we call history is not the full story. It is what remains of the story. Now think about that carefully. If large portions of the past are missing, then the timeline we follow is built on gaps. And those gaps matter because when information is missing, the human mind fills in the blanks. Patterns are created, assumptions are made, events are connected in ways that feel logical, even if the full context is unknown. This is not deception. It is reconstruction. But reconstruction has limits. Imagine trying to understand a book by reading only a few pages from each chapter. You might understand the general plot, but important details would be missing. Certain events might seem sudden or unexplained. Some connections might not make sense at all. That is how history works. We have pieces, but not always the full picture. And this is where the first crack in the timeline appears. Because if the timeline is built on incomplete information, then it is not as stable as it seems. It is a framework, a model that makes sense based on what we currently know. But as new discoveries are made, that model changes. History is constantly being revised. Dates shift, interpretations evolve, new evidence challenges old conclusions. This doesn't mean everything is uncertain, but it does mean that certainty has limits. And once you accept that, a new possibility begins to form, not that history is wrong, but that it may not be complete, because the timeline we follow feels continuous, but in reality, it may be stitched together from fragments, pieces of truth connected across missing information. And when you look at it that way, the question becomes unavoidable. If parts of the timeline are missing, what else might be missing with them? Because the biggest mystery may not be what we know about the past. It may be what we've never been able to see. And if the timeline itself is incomplete, then the story of humanity may be far more complex than we've ever been told. If the timeline we follow is built on fragments, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly is missing? Because history is not just about what has been preserved, it is also about what has been lost. And when you begin to examine that loss, the scale becomes difficult to ignore. Entire civilizations have disappeared with only traces left behind, cities buried, cultures erased, records destroyed by war, fire, and time. One of the most well-known examples is the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, a place believed to have contained vast amounts of knowledge from the ancient world. Its loss was not just the destruction of books, it was the disappearance of information that could have changed how we understand history today. And that is only one example. Across the world, similar events have occurred. Manuscripts lost, oral traditions forgotten, entire languages disappearing without translation. What remains is not a complete record, but scattered evidence pieces that survive by chance rather than design. Now think about what that means for the timeline itself. If key information has been lost, then certain transitions in history may not be fully understood. Periods of sudden change, where one civilization declines and another rises, may appear disconnected simply because the connecting details are missing. It's not that nothing happened in between, it's that we no longer have access to it. David Icke often highlights this idea not as proof of manipulation, but as a reminder of limitation. We assume continuity because the timeline appears continuous, but that continuity may be constructed from incomplete data. And when gaps exist, interpretation fills them. Historians build narratives based on available evidence, but those narratives can only be as complete as the records they rely on. This creates an important tension. On one hand, history is studied with rigorous methods and evidence-based reasoning. On the other, the absence of information leaves space for uncertainty. And uncertainty is where questions begin. Because if large portions of the past are missing, then it becomes difficult to say with complete confidence that we understand how events truly unfolded. Not because the truth is hidden, but because it may no longer exist in a recoverable form. This is where the idea of a hidden timeline begins to feel less like a theory and more like a consequence of incomplete records. Not that something was deliberately removed, but that over time, parts of the story simply disappeared. And when pieces disappear, the shape of the story changes. What we see as a smooth progression may actually be a sequence interrupted by unknown events, unknown influences, and unknown developments. So the real question is not just what we know about history, it is how much of it we no longer have access to, because within those missing pieces, there may be details that would change the way we understand the entire timeline. If parts of history are missing, then some of the most puzzling moments are not what we can't see, but what appears too quickly. Because when you look closely at human development, there are periods where progress seems steady, slow, gradual, understandable. But then there are moments where something shifts, knowledge appears, systems emerge, civilizations reach levels of complexity that seem to accelerate beyond what we might expect from the timeline alone. Take ancient Egypt, for example. Within a relatively short span of time, large-scale architecture, advanced organizational systems, and precise alignments with astronomical points were achieved. The pyramids are often discussed not as mysteries beyond explanation, but as examples of human capability that still raise questions about methods, planning, and the speed of development. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, systems of writing, mathematics, and law appeared early and developed into structured societies that laid the foundation for future civilizations. In ancient India, complex mathematical ideas and astronomical observations were recorded long before modern instruments existed. In Mesoamerica, highly accurate calendar systems track celestial movements with remarkable precision. These are not anomalies in the sense of being impossible. They are achievements that historians and scientists continue to study and explain through evidence and research. But here is where the question begins. Why do some of these developments feel accelerated? Why do certain breakthroughs appear in clusters rather than slowly evolving step by step? David Icke often frames this not as something mysterious in itself, but as something worth examining more closely. Because knowledge does not appear out of nothing. It is built over time, passed between generations, refined through trial and error. Yet in some cases, the early stages of that process are not clearly documented. We see the result, but not always the full path that led to it. This does not mean the path did not exist. It may simply mean it was not preserved. History, as we've already seen, is incomplete. Records are lost, context disappears. What remains is often the outcome, the visible achievement, without a detailed account of how every step was taken. And that creates a sense of suddenness. Progress appears faster than it may have actually been. But even with that understanding, certain patterns remain. Civilizations reach peaks of knowledge and organization and then decline, sometimes gradually, sometimes rapidly. The reasons vary: environmental changes, conflict, internal instability, but the cycle repeats. Rise, development, peak, collapse. And when a civilization declines, knowledge can be lost, not entirely, but enough to create a gap. The next civilization builds again, sometimes rediscovering ideas that were once known, sometimes advancing further. So the timeline is not just a straight line of progress, it is a series of cycles. And within those cycles, knowledge appears, disappears, and reappears. This is where the idea of a hidden timeline connects back in a subtle way. Not because knowledge was inserted or controlled, but because its movement through time is not perfectly recorded. We see fragments of progress, but not always the continuity between them. And when continuity is missing, progress can appear sudden. So the real question is not whether ancient civilizations were more advanced than we think. It is whether we fully understand how that knowledge developed and how much of that development has been lost along the way. If knowledge can appear suddenly and history contains gaps, then the next thing to examine is not individual events, but patterns. Because when you step back and look at human history as a whole, something begins to stand out. Civilizations across different continents and different time periods seem to follow a similar structure. They rise from small beginnings, expand, develop complex systems, reach a peak of influence and stability, and then, for reasons that are not always fully clear, they decline. This pattern is not limited to one region or one culture. It appears in ancient Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, in Mesoamerica, and in many other parts of the world. Each civilization is unique in its details, but the overall structure remains familiar: growth, peak, and collapse. Now, there are clear explanations for many of these declines. Environmental changes, resource depletion, internal conflict, external invasion, these are all well-documented factors that contribute to the fall of civilizations. History does not ignore these causes. In many cases, they are supported by strong evidence. But here's where the question begins. Why does this pattern repeat so consistently? Why do civilizations separated by time and geography follow such similar trajectories? David Icke often approaches this not as proof of something hidden, but as a reason to look at history from a wider perspective. Because patterns suggests structure, and structure suggests that there may be underlying forces, natural, social, or systemic, that influence how civilizations develop over time. Now, this does not require the idea of external control. Cycles exist in many systems. Nature operates in cycles. Climate changes over time. Populations grow and decline. Economies expand and contract. It is entirely possible that human civilizations follow similar cycles due to internal dynamics and environmental conditions. But the repetition is still worth examining, because when patterns repeat, they can also shape expectations. If a system tends to rise and fall, then the timeline of that system is not purely random. It follows a certain rhythm, even if the exact timing varies. And when you recognize that rhythm, the idea of a fixed linear progression begins to shift. History becomes less like a straight line and more like a series of waves. Each wave builds on the last, but also resets certain aspects of what came before. Knowledge is preserved in some areas and lost in others. Structures are rebuilt, sometimes stronger, sometimes differently. Over time, the overall picture evolves, but not in a simple, uninterrupted path. This is where the idea of a hidden timeline takes on a different meaning. Not hidden in the sense of being deliberately concealed, but hidden in the complexity of the pattern itself. When events are viewed individually, they may seem disconnected, but when viewed as part of a larger cycle, they begin to align in ways that are not immediately obvious. And yet, even with this understanding, there are still questions. Are these cycles purely natural? Are they driven entirely by human behavior and environmental factors? Or is there something deeper in the structure of time and history that shapes how these patterns unfold? There is no clear answer, but the repetition itself is real. And once you begin to see it, the timeline of Earth no longer feels like a simple progression. It begins to look like something more structured, something that may still hold patterns we have not fully understood. If history contains gaps, sudden developments, and repeating patterns, then the next question naturally follows: are these patterns purely the result of human behavior and natural cycles, or could there be another layer we don't fully understand? This is where the idea of timeline influence begins to emerge, not as a confirmed fact, but as a possibility worth examining. Because once you accept that time itself may not be as fixed as it appears, the concept of influence becomes less impossible and more uncertain. David Icke often frames this idea carefully, not as direct control or obvious manipulation, but as subtle shifts within a larger system. The key point is not that someone or something is rewriting history in a dramatic way, but that even small changes at the right moments could have long-term effects on how events unfold. Think about how cause and effect works. A single decision can change the direction of a life. A single event can alter the course of a nation. Small differences over time can lead to entirely different outcomes. This is not theory, it is how complex systems behave. And history, when viewed across centuries, is one of the most complex systems we know. Now imagine applying that idea to time itself. If time is not strictly linear, if moments are connected in ways we don't fully understand, then influencing a single point in the timeline could affect everything that follows, not in an obvious way, but in a gradual unfolding way. A discovery happens slightly earlier. A conflict begins slightly later. A key figure makes a different decision. Each change might seem small on its own, but over decades or centuries, those changes could reshape entire civilizations. This does not require complete control. It only requires influence. And influence, by its nature, is difficult to detect because it does not leave clear evidence. It does not create obvious breaks in reality. It blends into the normal flow of events, appearing as coincidence, chance, or natural variation. This is where the idea becomes both interesting and challenging. There is no direct proof that the timeline has been influenced. No confirmed evidence of external intelligence guiding human history. And without that evidence, the concept remains speculative. But the absence of proof does not eliminate the question. It simply places it in the realm of possibility. Because the more we learn about time, the more we see that it is not as simple as it once seemed. Physics shows that time can behave differently under certain conditions. Perception shows that our experience of time is not perfectly accurate. And history shows patterns that are not always easy to explain. When you combine these ideas, a new perspective begins to form. Not that history was controlled, but that it may not be entirely random. There may be structures, connections, and influences within the timeline that we have not yet fully understood, not necessarily external or intentional, but part of how complex systems evolve over time. So the question remains open, not as a claim, but as a possibility, because if even a small part of the timeline can be influenced, then the story of human history may be shaped by more than we currently recognize. And that possibility is enough to keep the question alive. After everything we've explored, the incomplete timeline, the missing pieces of the past, sudden leaps in knowledge, repeating patterns, and the possibility of subtle influence, we arrive at a point where the story does not end with an answer. It ends with a question. Because despite centuries of research, discovery, and analysis, human history is still not fully understood. New findings continue to reshape timelines, interpretations change, what once seemed certain becomes uncertain again. And in that process, one thing becomes clear: the past is more complex than the version we often accept. David Icke often focuses on this exact space, not where conclusions are made, but where questions remain, because it is in that space that perspective begins to shift, not toward belief and not toward denial, but toward awareness of limitation. The idea that the timeline of Earth might be incomplete is not controversial. Historians openly acknowledge that records are missing, that evidence is fragmented, and that much of human history has been lost over time. What is less discussed is what those missing pieces might mean for the larger picture. Because when information is missing, the structure built around it becomes uncertain. Not wrong, but not complete. This is where the idea of a hidden timeline becomes less about something being deliberately concealed and more about something being unresolved. A timeline shaped by what survived rather than what fully existed. And that distinction matters because it changes how we approach the question. Instead of asking, was history manipulated? We begin asking, how much of history do we actually understand? Those are two very different perspectives. The first looks for a definitive answer, yes or no. The second accepts that the answer may not yet be available. And that is where the discussion becomes more grounded. There is no confirmed evidence that human history has been controlled or manipulated by any external intelligence. There is no verified proof of timeline interference. And without that, the idea remains a question, not a conclusion. But the presence of unanswered questions is not insignificant, because history is filled with moments that are still being studied, still being debated, still being reinterpreted. New discoveries continue to challenge what we thought we knew. And each discovery reminds us that our understanding is still evolving. This is not a weakness, it is a process. Human knowledge grows by questioning itself, by recognizing gaps, by exploring possibilities without assuming certainty too quickly. So the real takeaway is not that something hidden is controlling the timeline. It is that the timeline itself may be more complex than we currently understand, more layered, more interconnected, more influenced by factors we have not yet fully identified. And that leads to the final realization. The question of whether history was manipulated may never have a simple answer. But the deeper question, how much of reality we truly understand, will continue to evolve, because every generation believes it has a clearer picture than the last. And yet, history shows that there is always more to discover. So perhaps the hidden timeline is not something waiting to be revealed all at once. Perhaps it is something we uncover gradually as our understanding of the past continues to expand. And until then, the question remains open, not as a mystery to be solved quickly, but as a reminder that the story of humanity is still being understood